Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bunker Show, coming to you live and direct from our secret bunker hidden beneath the sewers of Westminster. And we got a great show for you today. Joining us as ever is our ray of sunshine. Here's Helen.
Good evening, everyone. Really good to be here. Looking forward to tonight's show. It looks like it's going to be a really interesting one with a great guest. I'm in the chat room. If you've got any questions you'd like me to ask our guest, join us and come on in.
Also with us, as always, here's Jimmy.
Hey Fabrice and hey Helen. It's great to be back in the bunker. I'm really looking forward to talking to our guest tonight. It's one of my favourite subjects.
Today in the bunker we're going to be pushing the boat out a little bit and tackling one of those subjects which isn't often tackled by the usual media, and we'd hopefully be applying our usual reason, analysis, evidence-based inquisition, and seeing if we can come to the bottom of the tricky subject of UFOs. And we've got a great guest to help us do that today. He's an ex-police detective, so he's definitely got an understanding of investigation. He's published a UFO Truth Magazine, which is a great publication we're going to be talking about in a little while. And he's also collected a database from professional police observers who have seen UFOs, whether they're on duty or off duty. But these professionals, whose word is taken by a court as professional evidence, have reported UFOs, and Gary's done a great job in correlating and recording those. So our guest, Gary Heseltine, thank you for coming on the Bunker Show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
And Gary, how did you get started doing what you're doing?
That's a loaded question, and it'll take a long time to answer. But I guess the quick version is it's based on a childhood sighting that I had as a teenager that kind of left its mark, that didn't really manifest itself in terms of the police debate, the database that I created for police officers, until I was in my mid-40s, when I came across a publication on Leeds City Railway Station called UFO Magazine in the mid-1990s. So mid-30s is when I came across this magazine. And I'd always had an interest after the sighting. And basically that reawakened my interest. And I'd been away from the subject for 17, 18 years since I'd had it. And so I started to get the magazine. I started to read all the new books that come out in that intervening period. And one thing that struck me from the time of having my sighting when I was 16 years old to the time when I came across UFO Magazine in about 1995 was that nothing had really changed. The media was still trivializing the subject, despite the fact that there were some very credible reports from military pilots, commercial pilots, observer corps, police officers, radar operators, air traffic controllers, all people who ordinarily would be treated very well in terms of a court of law. And after a few years, I began to get frustrated with the way the media treated the subject and trivialized it. So eventually I came up with the idea for creating a database of police officers, unofficially, because it's something you couldn't do officially. But I created an unofficial national database to collate and collect police officer reports in the UK. I started off in January 2002 with 6 cases involving 10 police officers. Now, in 2016, I have over 550 reports involving over 1,000 British police officers. So that's how I became known within the UFO community, because one thing that I didn't anticipate was that when I created the database, I then started to be approached by UFO groups who would say, will you come and do a lecture for us? I'd never done a lecture for anybody in my life, but when I actually came to doing it, I found that it was something that came easily. I know many people would run from a large audience, but it's something that's never bothered me, and I actually enjoy that interaction with an audience.
And the first time I ever came across your work was actually, I believe, an article that I think you wrote actually in UFO Magazine. UFO Magazine was great because it was a beautiful colour, glossy magazine. It dealt with the subject intelligently. I could leave it on my coffee table, and it would be a great conversation starter.
Absolutely, it was very. It wasn't. It didn't gimmick the subject. It didn't sensationalize it. It was always evidence-based where possible. But it was particularly interested in the pilots, the astronauts, cosmonauts, radar operators. And this is what drew me to it, because it went for the credible people, as well as telling ordinary members of the public. But you've got to understand that when we talk about the subject of ufology in what I would call the mainstream media, the public have been fed really a constant lies for a good 60, 70 years. So it's not surprising that the public grow up thinking that there's little or nothing to the subject, because they're never really given the best evidence. And as a police detective for many years, a police officer of 24 years, until I retired to launch UFO Truth Magazine, an online e-zine featuring many of the world's top researchers, the public are really being given a bad deal because they've grown up almost without realizing it, being given a subliminal message in the media that there's little or nothing to this subject. Well, actually, nothing could be further from the truth. And that's easily demonstrated, I think.
And that can often be shown in the ways that whenever there are reportings of UFOs in the mainstream media, that they're often reported with cartoon pictures of aliens or a clip from the latest science fiction film.
Absolutely.
In a ridiculing style. And the odd thing, which I guess to the interested observer would be that you have air traffic controllers, pilots, people who you put your trust in when you go and travel in an aircraft.
Absolutely.
Those kind of people, whenever they mention the subject of UFOs, automatically it seems as though their credibility is undermined.
Well, you think about this. This is something I often do bring up during my lectures. Is this situation where a pilot, when you get on a plane and go off to fly on holiday around the world, when you get on a plane, you hand your life to the pilot and the aircrew to get you from A to B in safety. You give him absolutely your life. Yet How comes that pilot, who then has a sighting in broad daylight with his aircrew, with some of the passengers, with the stewardesses and stewards and whatever, everybody sees it, but then they're dismissed? And it also goes to this scenario where imagine if there's a passenger plane from flying to London, New York, and it has to ditch in the sea. Everybody dies apart from the pilot, who miraculously survives. Who do you think the air traffic investigation team would want to speak to? The pilot, because of his training and his background and what went on. Well, how comes that in the same scenario where we have a very good UFO scenario, that's just dismissed? In every other circumstance, he would be a fantastic number one witness.
And, in any other air crash investigation with those sort of incidents, especially involving people's lives, especially involving multi-million pound pieces of machinery, whether they're carrying passengers or are flying for other reasons, they take those investigations very seriously. Absolutely. Yet it seems with UFOs that isn't the case. In fact, I don't know in your position if you would have come across professionals who feel inclined not to have reported those things for fear of the impact it might have professionally for them.
Absolutely. I mean, whilst I predominantly have researched police officers over the years, professional people have contacted me to tell me about their own experiences, and that's from reporters, believe it or not. Mainstream national reporters have told me stories that have happened to them, but they can't tell anybody about it because they fear for their job, fear the ridicule factor, fear it may affect promotion, etc. I've had architects, I've had even women that run care homes. I've had women that run creches, but they daren't go public because they're suddenly going to, if they do, they might get labelled a nutter, and then they lose all the people coming to the creche or to the care home. Well, what a ridiculous and a terrible indictment of society that this trivialising of the subject has been allowed to happen for so long, and it really stems back to 1953, if the public aren't aware of that. And just to digress, the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, commissioned in 1953 what was called the Robertson Panel. It was a team of top scientists of all different persuasions, but the idea of it, through the CIA, was to kind of get rid of the UFO problem, or as it was then, the flying saucer problem. And these secret documents have been released through Freedom of Information Act, and this is what it basically says. It says we are going to work with the media to strip the aura of flying saucers, and we are going to work with the media to dumb down the subject. And that's exactly what's happened since 1953. So here we are, 2016, 63 years later. That's a terrible indictment of society, that it's almost created this fear factor, and it's been allowed to go unchecked for 63 years. We still have it.
Well, if we go back to 1953, I mean, that's an interesting starting point. I remember seeing pictures of lights flying near the White House.
Well, that was 1952, and that was July 1952, which in itself is amazing, because for 2 successive weekends in July 1952, there were captured on radar and also seen visually multiple UFOs, sometimes 8, 9 at a time, flying over what is restricted airspace of Washington. It was almost a demonstration. Now, is there any evidence to back that up? Well, yes, there is, because the guy who ran the air traffic controller for Washington, D.C., Harry Barnes, went public and said we were tracking, in his opinion, real objects for over 9 hours over the Capitol. And that happened on 2 successive weekends. And it actually prompted the biggest press conference since the end of the Second World War. And a little bit of background, there was such an interest at that time, and it was before the real secrecy began, that the media were genuinely interested to know what was happening, that when they had this press conference, the guy who ran it was General Sanford. And we know that historically he and some other senior military figures were quite keen to tell the truth on the subject. But in the end, when it came to the press conference, they basically trivialized it and said there's nothing we can't explain. And the ones that we haven't got, if we had more information, we're pretty sure we could explain that. And that didn't reflect many of the fantastic cases or highlight what had been recorded by the very credible people, i.e. Harry Barnes, the senior air traffic controller for Washington, D.C. He was not there. People like that they could have quoted, but they didn't. And they chose to trivialize it. And really, the secrecy starts to build after that.
Hi, Gary. It's Jimmy here.
Hi, Jimmy.
I'm a bit of a science fiction movie fan, and it's really interesting hearing those dates, 1952, 1953, because around about that time, you start seeing films like The Day the Earth Stood Still and Earth versus the Flying Saucers, etc., etc. So,
The Day the Earth Stood Still is interesting because basically that script had to be approved by the military. And there were close correlations with the message of that kind of, like, mess with nuclear weapons, you'll destroy the world, blah, 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 that were quite closely associated. So the script had to be approved by the military for that film. And there was correlation between many of the senior figures in the filmmaking world with senior intelligence officials. So this is not just a science fiction story per se. There was a lot more to it than that.
So there was a military interest in how, at that time, as you said, the flying saucers were being
portrayed.
perceived.
It was a very intelligent script.
Yeah, and there must have been. There's an incident in Los Angeles, I think, in 1942, where there were lights in the sky, and they listed off 2,500 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition.
I think it was about 1,500 rounds, but basically,
that's still an awful lot.
Oh, it is, and the downside was that the shells that were let off were pretty big shells, and the shell casings that came down killed 6 people during that barrage. Which is incidental, but not very nice if you're one of the 6. What people don't realise on that is that radar tracked the object coming up the eastern seaboard for about 100 miles before it stopped and hovered, and then it's illuminated by the big beams for to light up the sky, and it's in the crosshairs, and they are trying everything in their damnedest to blow this thing up, and nothing happens. And then off it went. So totally unaffected.
And so, those are just 2 incidents we've spoken about that time, just before 1953, that shows the military and the CIA at a very high level were taking the issue of unidentified flying objects very, very, very seriously.
Oh, absolutely.
And in terms of how that imposition on the media. I mean, if we can talk about a couple of the other cases that are very, very solid. If we can talk a little bit about Tehran and the F4s and a bit about Rendlesham,
the Tehran sighting, yeah.
Yeah, and Rendlesham Forest as well.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on Rendlesham.
Yeah. Because when you have those kind of incidents with the consistent media ridicule, it can sometimes be quite hard to say, actually, that's an important event that happened there. We'd still like answers to get to the bottom of it.
Well, the real frustration is the way the mainstream present the evidence. So occasionally they will do some good coverage, but then the same people will then a few weeks later do a piece trivializing it, so it remains inconsistent. I now, over the last 14 years of my research, must have done 20 odd documentaries for mainstream in the UK, and basically they all follow a similar pattern. The first 20 minutes they'll tell a classic pilot case, really interesting, really evidential. Then the next 20-minute segment, they'll then start to go into the iconic alien head greys abductions. And then in the last 20 minutes, they'll go to the people on top of the hill wearing tin lead, going on me, making us all look stupid. And all that's happened is the interest level of the audience was really high when they're talking about the pilot, begins to plateau off when they're talking about the iconography of ufology, and then when it goes to the silly people who bring the subject down, of which any subject will have a certain number of people attached to it, then the interest level goes. So what you end up with is, at the end of the programme, you end up with status quo, which is exactly what the mainstream documentary makers want to do. Because don't forget, those people make a bid to make the programme, and they have to put in the bottom line of what it's going to be at the end, especially in this subject. And the end point is nothing to affect the status quo. And that's virtually all documentaries that are made in the UK about this subject.
I've seen you also deal with the media when you had the opportunity to do that live.
On this morning, twice.
And
but what people don't realise with those 2 appearances on This Morning was that the first appearance, I was deliberately surly, looking to provoke them into a challenge. People don't realise this, but when you're on live television and suddenly when you're actually dealing with this subject, it's very rare that somebody like me, who knows what evidence is, having been a detective, knows what would stand up in a court of law. It's very rare for live television to give me a platform. So I realised that I would get very few opportunities to actually make any points. So I literally did timings on what I thought might be a few little intro pieces that I could get in. And the whole aim of that was to be surly and to say, come on, let me show you the evidence because I know what evidence is. And they actually fell for it. because that was in the February of 2012, and it provoked a big interest. So they invited me back in April. But here's the thing: originally, after the end of the first show, the presenters were saying, "This is great. We should have you back all the time." Blah blah blah. Really interested. And they said, "Right, okay, 5 cases. You present 5 cases of best evidence." And I thought, great. And then they go, "Oh well, over a week, 3 cases." Actually, 1 case. You choose. So I did Rendlesham Forest because I'd done a lot of research. But again, when I went just before going live on that, and I knew this would be the case, they had told me when I was going to speak, what the other person said, what I was going to say. And this is live television. It was so scripted, it was a joke. I might as well have been a robot. Well, again, it was an opportunity for me on live television to do something a little bit different. So I had things prepared, photographs in my pocket, coins in my pocket to illustrate points. And obviously, when I started doing this, I'm going off script, and they don't know where to look. And that's what makes it more entertaining. But it also makes it more real, because they don't want me to make all the points that I can make. They have to be seen to be fair, in inverted commas. Well, have you ever dealt with a subject where, for example, you do a cookery show and you have your cookery experts? Do you have an anti-cookery expert there? If you have an antique show, do you have an antique expert and an your antique expert? Well, you don't. But when it comes to UFOs, we have to give the skeptics a platform. No other subject would you get this. Even ghosts don't get challenged in the same way that ufology does. And why is that? And I find that very puzzling.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, how they like to place the filters in between the real information, the audience, and very glad that's something that we don't do here in Dark City, because we have questions coming in live and direct from our chat room.
Yeah.
And I think Helen's got a few.
I do have a couple here. The first one was the Alien Races book. Is it real or not?
The Alien Races book?
Yeah, 58 races of alien races. Are they real? That was one question we had. I don't know.
Well, 1, I've not got the book. 2, I've not heard of that book. I am aware that some people speculate that there are 58 Heinz beans kind of figure, 57 varieties kind of thing. The bottom line is, do I believe that there are aliens visiting here? Yes, I do, based on the circumstantial evidence case, the best evidence, which is only 3% of all sightings. Generally, you've got to rule out 95% of everything through mistaken atmospheric, just basic mistake. Then you're left with 5%. Of that 5%, when you investigate further, you can strip away another 2%. But as ever, you end up with a hardcore of 3%. Well, this isn't 3% of 5 cases. This is 3% of millions of cases. So we're talking many, many thousands of excellent cases. And if you look at the number of pilots that's gone on record, you're looking at 2,000 military pilots worldwide who've gone on the record, many to say that they've been sent up to intercept radar-confirmed targets, and then they have ended up in dogfight situations with the UFOs. Well, if you give a military pilot a jet fighter worth many millions of pounds, and you spent probably millions on his flight education, why do we not then believe him when he says, I chased it, I tried to fire at it, I did fire at it, and nothing happened? I can quote you cases where that's actually happened, if you want me to.
Hey, thanks, Gary. That's a really good answer. The other question I have here for you is, what do you think will happen if proof of alien life visiting Earth was disclosed to the general public? In other words, why would you think the authorities are covering up evidence, and what would be the consequences of the public knowing that we've been visited? There's quite a lot there.
It's a very big question, but the bottom line is, there may well have been genuine reasons why governments around the world wanted to keep it secret when they became aware of it in at least the mid-40s. I would say perhaps early 40s, mid-40s, they became aware that there was something else visiting this planet. The threat of the Cold War and triggering into a third World War, and obviously nuclear Armageddon, was maybe a very good reason why you would keep it secret if ET was proven to exist. The bottom line is, I think that reason it doesn't become valid after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we should have started telling the truth. But the bottom line is, does Obama want to stand up on the White House lawn and say, well, actually, we've been lying to you for about 60-odd years. We did it in your best interest, but these things are real. And I don't think he wants to do that, because does he want to admit that the US are not in charge of their airspace? And the reality is no country is in charge of their airspace, because UFOs can come with impunity and in reality are able to render themselves visible and invisible. So visible and invisible. Well, that means they can be on radar and then just blink off radar. Now, that has been proven worldwide. Now, there are many other factors to it, but the bottom line is I don't think they want to tell the truth, because it changes the equation in terms of loss of power. If for example, as I believe, that UFOs have harnessed gravity and they use electrogravity to move around and do these weird and wonderful maneuvers that ordinary aircraft can't do, then that probably means that there's no need for fossil fuels, there's no need for jet engines and petrol-driven cars. Well, that would be good, but you try telling that to Shell and BP that all their oil revenues are just not needed anymore, because we've probably harnessed a different technology that doesn't require any of those. I don't think they will want to lose their billions of dollars of profits by admitting that there might be other forms of energy. So it's a very complex question, but the bottom line is it's suppressed because primarily I think it's about loss of power. I don't think the world will panic now like it may have done in the 50s and 60s. I don't think that would happen now.
So it's bad for their economies and for their
absolutely.
comfortable lifestyles.
They lose everything. They're not the power. The US would not be then. It's the superpower it thinks it is.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Because suddenly everybody is vulnerable. And it also sends a message out that we are vulnerable to attack if they so wanted to. That said, I think there are many species coming here, and most come and watch us a bit like we swim with the fish in the Great Barrier Reef. We just watch and observe. And that's exactly what we would do if on Mars, say Mars had an atmosphere and we sent a spaceship there, what would we do if we came across some microscopic pond life or whatever, or fish in a river or whatever on a new planet? What would we do? We'd study it. We'd watch it. We'd examine it. And that's exactly what they do to us. I think the vast majority of species are probably benign, but clearly when you expand the subject to the areas like animal mutilations, human mutilations, abductions, which are terrible and frightening for the majority, then clearly some species are not so nice. So
there's another question here, Gary. Any idea why the 7-foot skeleton-type aliens were beaming us up, drilling into our skulls, and then beaming us down again? 2002 to 2006, this happened.
I'm not aware of what you're talking about.
No, so you don't. Yeah, you haven't.
Don't know.
I'm just.
I'm not aware of this case that you're referring to.
Also, something I wanted to highlight is we have a listener in the chat room called Darren, who didn't know you were our guest today and tuned in to listen to the Bunker Show, but actually emailed you 10 minutes ago with some information and footage, I think. So that was quite an interesting little coincidence there.
Yeah. Well, there is something that I would like to say that what I'm doing at the moment is I'm writing the book about a book about all the police officer cases on the database. So what I would ask is that I put an appeal out through your show to any police officer, serving or retired, to email me at heseltinegary@hotmail.com, and I'm sure you'll put my contact details up on your website. But they can be included in the book if they come forward. I'm hoping to have the book out by the end of the year. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And, I'd like to reiterate that if you can't get hold of Gary, get hold of us here at the Bunker Show, and we'll definitely pass on your information and contact details. Because it is really important to get the professional observers, even if it happened a fair few years ago. It's always worth coming forward and bring your information to the database, because it can cross-reference with other people, and it's always good to have a record of these things from credible observers, because that builds up that evidential trail that you were talking about.
Absolutely.
I mean, we mentioned briefly about Tehran. Now, there were a couple of F-4 fighter jets, which are Phantoms, big multi-role fighter jets, a fair few million quid each. As you said, the pilots.
Fabrice Jafari was the main pilot, who went on to become a general.
Okay, so he was promoted up afterwards. I mean, that's an excellent case, I guess, of the military engaging UFOs.
Absolutely. I mean, for your listeners who aren't aware of that, it's a complicated case. But suffice to say, initially a radar confirmed object was seen near the airport in Tehran, and it was seen by the air traffic controllers with binoculars, ground visual. A general saw it on ground level, and he ordered an interceptor, one F-4, to go up after it. As he got to, he was being vectored towards the aircraft. Basically, he lost all his instrumentation. All his computers went down, and he had to return to base. When he got slightly to get within 25 miles of the object that he was chasing, they then sent up another F-4, and as he started to move in, he experienced some mechanical difficulties as well, and whatever. But he didn't lose, but he was able to get closer to it. And then as he got closer towards the UFO, which he described as like diamond shape and flashing in a sequence of 4 colours, that basically an object, a red object, was dispatched from the diamond-shaped object at speed directly towards his plane on a head-on collision. So it was like he thought he was going to die. It was that fast and that dangerous that he thought he was going to die. He tried to get his weapon systems failed, and basically this then object, just as it was about to hit the plane, performed an amazing manoeuvre and just went round the plane, and then it re-emerged back with the diamond. Then later on, he saw another object dropping down to the ground and landing effectively on the ground, and it was illuminating the whole area. It's an amazing case, and that guy went on record, and he became General Parvez Jafari. It's one of the best cases in the world. We know the documentation exists because of a Defense Intelligence Agency American policy file came out on it. So this is a real case, and perhaps
it was an American jet at that time. The Iranians were getting American training. It was state of the art.
Oh, it was the top jet fighter of the time. And if you think of the kind of Vietnam films, it was the main jet of the Vietnam War.
And of course, the ability to do any kind of air-to-air activity, especially air-to-air docking. I mean, for in-flight refueling is an extremely complicated task. So to be able to do those kind of manoeuvres at that kind of speed is something definitely extraordinary.
Oh, absolutely. And let me quote you another case. And I actually met this pilot, and he was called Colonel, he's still alive, Colonel Oscar Santa Maria. And basically, he was a Peruvian pilot, military pilot, and I think it was 1980. He was sent up to, again, a radar-confirmed, visually seen object. And as he vectored towards the plane, towards the object, he thought it was a balloon. It looked like a balloon shape. And he was actually ordered to fire his machine guns to blow up what he thought was a balloon. Now, this is broad daylight, this is not at night, this is clearly visually seen on radar. And basically, he opened up his machine guns and fired, I think, 64 rounds at this balloon, and he expected it to blow up, but it didn't. The bullets just didn't do anything to it. They were absorbed, and there was nothing. And then what the object did was suddenly did a vertical climb of, I think, 10,000 feet in 3 seconds. So it didn't just fly off, it just went straight up, which is beyond our capability just to move like that. And then he had to work his way up with afterburners to catch up and to reach it at the next level. And again, he was going to attack it again. As soon as he got into a position to attack it again, it just went straight up, vertical again, another 10,000 feet. And he eventually did this 4 times, could never, ever get chance to actually attack it. And it left when it was about 60-odd thousand feet in the air. And then he was low on fuel and he had to come back. These cases are absolutely fantastic. And that pilot went on the record on video. You could stand him up before Parliament and he would tell you the story and your jaw would be on the floor, because this is a guy and it's all real. All the documentation is out there, and he gave evidence at what was called the citizens' hearings in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago before a former senator and 5 congressmen and women with 80 years of public service. It was brilliant.
So a professional who's authorised to fire rocket cannons, well, not rocket cannons.
He did fire them.
You know, and those shells, each one of those is as big as your fist and does an awful lot of damage.
I think they were 64mm, huge shells.
Okay, yeah. So they're some of the biggest. And when that happens, that's another really strong case, one that I hadn't heard of before, and are going to look into, because the more of those that you have, the harder it is for people to ridicule the subject and divert away from those questions.
Absolutely, and that's the frustration, that these excellent cases are out there, but the media, certainly in this country, are generally not aware of any of them. Why is that? It doesn't make sense. If it was any other subject, we'd know about it, but not when it comes to UFOs.
And I think, you know, that's why I'm really appreciative for Dark City to let us have the Bunker Show on every week. I'm really appreciative to you, Gary, for coming on and informing us about some of these cases that stand, that give questions that stand, so that you know, people can pose those questions and realise there is something very important that needs addressing. And Rendlesham Forest is one of those cases that I know you've looked into and a real expert on. And for me, I mentioned this in our review of the year last year, where we briefly touched on this with some of our previous guests, Andrew Johnson and Ben Emlyn Jones.
Yeah.
And with Rendlesham Forest, there was an incident that happened between Christmas and New Year in 1980, where Rendlesham Forest sits between 2 bases, RAF Bentwaters and the United States Air Force Base Woodridge, which at the time was the largest nuclear armed air base in Europe. It was commanded at the time by Deputy Base Commander. I think at that time he was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, and he's now a full colonel, I believe.
Yeah.
And essentially, either Colonel Holt and his men were mistaken that something landed in the forest without their authorization or control. And they mistook lighthouses, swamp gas, fireballs, Venus.
Can I just come in there?
Yeah, sure, Gary.
Yeah, because I realise that time is relatively short. Just to clarify, this is not one incident. This is a series of incidents over 3 successive nights. There are 3 successive nights of UFO activity at or near the base between the 26th, the morning of the 26th, going into the morning of the 28th. And there are perhaps anywhere up to 60 military witnesses involved, plus a host of civilians living at or near the base who saw things from their bedroom windows, gardens, etc. It's an absolutely amazing case. But let me tell you a little anecdote about Colonel Holt. I met him and worked with him for 6 years on developing a film script that I did write. But basically, cutting a long story short, in my research with him, I got him to retrace his steps of where he went out with his team of men on what was the third night of activity, where he personally became involved and saw multiple UFOs himself, along with the 4 other sergeants and lieutenant that was with him. But the main thing is, the skeptics will say, oh, well, it was a lighthouse. It was the Orphan Nest Lighthouse. Well, here's one thing that could never be explained if it was told properly on the TV. I actually went with him, retraced his steps, and identified where he had an amazing encounter in a field where a UFO approached at high speed, stopped dead, and hovered over his team, and then shone a laser beam down at his feet for about 15 to 20 seconds. The team that were with him were in awe. They thought, is this a communication? Is this a threat? And then the beam went off and the UFO went away. But there are multiple UFOs in the air at the same time. Well, if that one act of the 3 days can just be taken in isolation, what could have caused that in a conventional terms? What can approach at high speed, no noise, put a beam down, stop and hover and put a beam down, and then race away without any noise? Answer is nothing that we can conventionally explain. The skeptics will say that that's a lighthouse. Now, when I was asked to make 2 recent documentaries for Channel 4, Channel 5, I said, I'll give you a world exclusive, but I bet you don't run it. And they said, oh, we're very interested. We will run it. I said, well, I'll give you an exclusive. It's never been shown on film, on mainstream TV, where that incident took place, where the beam comes down at the men's feet. Oh, right, we'll film this. Filmed it. Did it end up in the final cut? No. Why was it out of the final cut? Because they still wanted to talk about the lighthouse. Well, unless it's a flying lighthouse that can lift up off the ground, move at high speed, stop as a lighthouse above you, and then shine a beam down, it's clearly not a lighthouse. But for them to make the show, the real truth had to go out the window. And what a terrible indictment of filmmaking.
It's very clear to see that when you have those kind of excuses put forward, or that kind of reasoning, if you have a man who's in charge of an atomic base, who can mistake a flying lighthouse, should he really be in charge of an atomic base? That has some kind of national security implications.
Absolutely. It was always ludicrous, but what I'm saying is the mainstream want to do this fairness thing, and if they'd have included that one clip, the lighthouse theory is dead and buried in a nutshell. They couldn't do that because they still wanted to include it.
Yeah, it seems like they're much more interested in the hype, because, I mean, you showed a photograph of when I believe you were with Colonel Holt, yep. And you can quite clearly see that there's a farmhouse, which in his report he shows yep. it in relation to what he's reporting, and you can quite clearly see that the lighthouse is a fair distance away.
Yep.
And the official report is that what happened at Rendlesham Forest has no national security implications.
It's a nuclear base. It's a joke. Of course it has.
For me, I can't see how that's possible.
It sounds a lot like damage control, as opposed to, they're not denying something happened. It sounds like they're trying to brush over what actually happened. Would you agree?
Well, I think no, I disagree. On the face of it, and to people who aren't aware of the subject, that's how it will come across. And there is that element to it. But when you know the subject and you know the shenanigans that's gone on over the years, you'll realise that this is not just kind of chance. This is a deliberate policy to obstruct and deceive the public.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at. It's interesting that have you heard of any other incidents that involve significant military targets?
Oh, absolutely. The UFOs have been seen since the 40s over nuclear power plants, ballistic missile sites, submarine bases, any kind of bulk fuel installation, huge nuclear power plants all around the world. And this has been well recorded and been reported by military officials. It's all written down. It's all in report form. that is well known. So UFOs have definitely, or some species of UFO have definitely got an interest in nuclear weapons. And I suspect that the reason for that is actually might be closer to home. Many people don't realise that we know more about the surface of the moon and Mars than we do about the oceans. We actually know only 1% of the oceans. What a lot of your audience won't realise is that UFOs worldwide have been seen both leaving the water and taking off into the air and entering water. Now, wouldn't it strike you that it's quite possible, if we only know 1%, that in that 99% there may be underwater bases, as some people speculate? To me, it makes perfect sense. And that's why I think those species who were there have got an interest in this planet, because if we are on the brink of annihilating each other, then their natural habitat in the deep oceans would well be affected as well. So that's why I think they're interested specifically in nuclear weapons. I think it's far closer to home than just in space.
And that partially answers a question from our chat room as well, which was, why do you think aliens are visiting Earth, and what's motivating them to come here?
Well, like I said to you in an earlier answer, I actually think that the vast majority of species that come here just never have any contact, just watch. Like we would, like I say, if we swim in the Great Barrier Reef, we go there because the diversity of the fish and the plant life, it's a fantastic location. Well, if you think of the Great Barrier Reef as the Earth, then if you add that in our bit of cosmic neighbourhood, let's just say that in our bit of cosmic neighbourhood, the Earth is like an oasis in the desert with an abundance of water and is rich in life and fauna. Now, if that is a fairly rare in our bit of the cosmic neighbourhood, if you were a spacefaring nation, then you'd think, I want to go there because it's like the Great Barrier Reef, and I want to look and see what's going on. But don't forget, I think we're extremely primitive. Mankind is very arrogant, and science is arrogant when they go, oh, the distances involved are crazy. They are crazy, but they're crazy to us, but they might not be crazy to an alien race that have developed 1 million years ahead of Earth time. Then they're not going to be riding around in jet engine planes and petrol-driven cars, are they? They'll be 1 million years ahead of us, and if we know anything about technology in the last 100 years, it has evolved, is evolving at an exponential rate. We can't even keep up with new things that are coming out.
It's interesting to see, some elements of technology and some, like the internal combustion engine and the reliance on the petroleum industry, don't seem to be evolving as fast as one might expect. There's been many reported sightings of black triangles, and they've been able to do great things like 30G turns plus, which even some of our most advanced fighter jets can only pull.
And there's telemetry data to back that up. There's a very famous case from Belgium in 1993 where two F-16 military jets ended up in a 75-minute dogfight with a UFO. And all the telemetry data was recorded. All the cockpit instrumentation was videoed. And it was confirmed on 7 military radars, different types of radar. 3 were military, 4 were civilian, and tracked. And that telemetry data at certain points showed that the UFO made maneuvers that are impossible for any terrestrial object and pulled in the region of 35 to nearly 40 Gs at various points. Well, the maximum for stealth even now is only 11 to 12. So this is an object that's 3 times that.
With technology like that, do you think that the military are interested? And we've spoken about Edgar Fouché previously on the bunker, and some of his
TR-3B and the
ability to use gravity dampening fields of some nature or description. Do you think the military are involved in some of that back technology, and do you think they're involved in other things such as crop circle making?
Well, I think you've got to understand two things. When I do my lectures and I point this out, is where do we get our evidence from? And the reality is there's two worlds. There's the secret world of need to know, and you, everybody listening to your show virtually will not have the need to know because we're not in that military circle to have the level of classification to get these top secrets. Now that basically says that government and military intelligence control the subject, and you'll never have that unless you're in that. You're never going to have the classification to have the need to know. So that's the secret world, and then we have to rely on, and this is what I rely on, is the public domain, because that's the only way I will get my information. It's not going to come from anywhere else. It's going to come from pilots like Parvis Jafari, General Parvis Jafari, to go on the record, like Colonel Oscar Santamaria, to go on the record, and then all the paperwork to back it up. It's two worlds, secret world.
Do you think there do you think there are dummies? I mean, I mentioned crop circles earlier. We've espoused the possibility that there are.
I think 95% of crop circles are man-made by professional circle makers, but many of them. So that leaves another 5% or 3% that are well worth further investigation. Absolutely, and there's characteristics of genuine crop circles with the blown nodes. They're blown out as if microwave. They're laid out in a different pattern, and also the knuckles can sometimes elongate on genuine ones. You need to see the pictures, but there are physical characteristics that make a certain small percentage of crop circles absolutely not done by man.
And it's interesting.
This Doug and Dave thing was a joke.
Yeah, I recommend people look into the ones that haven't been Doug and Dave that haven't been trampled.
It's a joke.
Do you think there's something that just kind of come up with crop circles, which is you mentioned it earlier about UFOs blipping in and blipping out. Do you think there's a transdimensional aspect to ufologies where effectively with things such as the Philadelphia experiment, where electromagnetic fields can actually give the effect of appearance and disappearance?
Well, I certainly think there are effects, and many years. I think it's a complex subject. I try to go from an evidential point of view and stick with like the military cases, the things, the hardware. But the subject is far more complicated than that. And we now know through development of physics, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, that now we're looking at multi-universes. The particle that was split, the Higgs boson particle, and the Large Hadron Collider, that effectively, the God particle, allowed for the fact that there may well be multiple dimensions, many more than what we think, maybe 10, 12, and there are probably multiple universes. Now, if that's the case, then you can allow for the fact that these objects may be able to go from one realm into another. But that's not an area of my expertise, but it's certainly where we are now. It's a multifaceted thing. But I see my role is, as a detective, a former detective, is to say to the public on the ground, well, let's start off with the very credible cases, because that's how they're drawn in. I think a classic thing, what you get is there'll be a radio show, and then they'll on the TV, and they'll do a show, and they'll say, "Oh, people ring in and whatever," and they start talking about abductions straight away because it's a controversial topic. A lot of the audience think, "Oh, they're all crazy." The abduction phenomena is real; it's worldwide. You've got the same stories emerging worldwide, even in areas of the third world where they don't have access to TV and media. But that's not the way it's presented in the media, and people just think it's crazy. So people turn off. The reality is that it's a multifaceted subject. Like I said earlier, you have got animal mutilation, some human mutilation cases. You've got crop circles under that banner. You've got alien implants in that banner. You know, people are people aware that 17 mysterious objects have been removed from people who claim to be abducted, that were seen on X-ray, that have been removed surgically on video, and that these objects all had a commonality that will look like the size of a pea with a shell, a skin around it, protective surface that couldn't be cut with a scalpel. Inside it's terrestrial metals that we know about, but they're put in a composite that we're not aware of, and there's an oily substance inside. Now, these are believed to be tracking devices, which is what abductees say, that they're generally the abduction begins in childhood, often runs in families, and in fact, yesterday I spoke to a police officer who was just revealed to me a lifetime's experiences. He's now retired, but I'm currently investigating his story. But you know, this is worldwide. So ufology is multifaceted, and crop circles are definitely a part of that. And there are some messages in the crop circles, and we can't recreate them. We've never ever been able to recreate some of the really big ones that are half a mile wide in what is 4 or 5 hours to put them down overnight.
Hey Gary, our radio show hosts are asking, this is such an interesting show, are you available to go a little longer? And they'll book back the next show for half an hour if you're available to continue. Would that be a possibility?
I'm happy to
Excellent.
do that. No, that's fine.
Right, then we'll do another half an hour if that's all right with you.
Ask a question.
A bit of an X-Files Bunker show extension, and the Dark City Cannabis Compassion Club will be coming up, right after us in about half an hour or so. With the transdimensional aspect, that can be very, very hard for people to understand, I guess, when they see lights in the sky that blip on and blip off, or when they see things sort of closer up. So do you think that that's a field of ufology, or that's an element of ufology that doesn't get as much focus on it as, for example, some of the more nuts and bolts elements of the UFOs, like the Geiger counter readings that you were party to at Rendlesham?
Well, the reality is, and again, it ties into the media response, because sadly, the members of the public for the last probably 100 years or so have been seeing incredible things that they can't explain. But in reality, because of the way the media treat the subject, they don't really get given any credence, and they're even more ridiculed than the likes of pilots and whatever. That's harder for the mainstream to explain away. But what they do there is they just simply don't report on the cases. So it's done by omission. They don't necessarily lie. They just do it by omission. If you don't report on it, nobody knows about it. But they'll stick to the public, and they'll make it sound like all these members of the public are crazy. But people are seeing. Let me quote you an example of what I would call validation. Over the years, I get lots of phone calls from members of the public, and they tell me their stories. Well, imagine that in one particular week, I get a phone call from somebody living in the south of England, and they basically say that they're driving along a country road, it's late at night, they've got the kids in the car, and then suddenly they see an object the size of a car flying alongside their car on the long country road at night. It's just above hedgerow, so it's literally just above the car, running parallel with their car in total silence for about a mile and a half, and then it shoots away. So you get that. In isolation, you'd think crazy people. Then a week or so later, I get another story from Scotland. Wife and kids in the car, late at night, lonely country road, object the size of 3 cars, a tube, a cylindrical shape, travelling at hedgerow alongside the car for a mile and a half. These people don't know each other. And then I hear another story within another week. So I get 3 identical cases, unrelated, all around the country. Now, when I got the third one and the second one, the hairs on the back of my neck went up, because you cannot get better validation that something is really going on when you get these 3 independent accounts of multiple witnesses to an event telling exactly the same story. So these stories that have been recorded in newspapers for 100 years or so are very, very common. Lonely country road, UFO seen travelling alongside the car, and whatever. But these cases are just not publicised. They're trivialised because people nowadays in the media want to stick to the sensational aspects of aliens, greys, strange-looking creatures, and
the hype, I guess, rather than actually, boiling down what's really going on.
Well, the thing is,
I should imagine that increases the value. It gives some perspective to the value of people. So when they have seen something, to see if they can report it, and I guess to put in the structures so that those reports don't get lost on somebody's desk, but actually go to be correlated to.
Yeah, but here's the thing now. In 2009, in December 2009, the Ministry of Defence closed its UFO reporting desk, which had operated for over 50 years. And they said the reason was it was a cost-cutting exercise to save £55,000. The reality was it was done because the Ministry of Defence were getting bogged down in freedom of information requests all about UFOs, and less about the defence and army and navy and whatever. They were getting bogged down in that. And they wanted to get rid of the UFO problem. The Ministry of Defence have repeatedly lied and played down the significance of UFOs deliberately because they have fallen in to the same pattern that was created by America. What you have to understand is the United States are the most powerful nation on the earth in terms of UFOs. They control the subject.
And would that be why some people say the intelligence agencies or in fact, I think Richard D. Hall has documented it very, very clearly in terms of crop circles being manufactured, again, to provide that element of ridicule.
Absolutely.
I mean, you run some great conferences associated with UFO Truth Magazine. And I strongly suggest that people check out the one you've got coming next this coming year with
in September 10th and 11th in Holmfirth in West Yorkshire, where the two headline speakers will be Travis Walton. If you think of the most famous living abductee, that's the guy, the logger in the woods in 75, who basically was abducted for 5 days. All his loggers that were with him were effectively questioned because they thought he'd been murdered by them. They passed lie detector tests, he passed lie detectors, and basically his story was made into quite a good Hollywood film called Fire in the Sky with James Garner, D.B. Sweeney, which was a pretty faithful recreation of everything on the ground. I met Travis Walton in 2010, and I asked him about how good a interpretation it was, the film, and he said basically everything in the woods, everything leading to me being taken aboard was pretty spot on. He said, but then Hollywood did its best and totally changed the visual look of what happened inside the craft. But effectively, he's the most famous abductee.
I was going to say, what happened inside the craft in the film Fire in the Sky, which is a great film with a fantastic performance from James Garner. And a big marijuana advocate, I believe, James Garner. And on that note, just for people who've tuned in, the Dark City Cannabis Compassion Club will be kicking off at 8:30 this evening, and we're into overtime with Gary Heseltine. And it's a really interesting story, as you said, because they thought that Travis had been bumped off by his mates, and they took it incredibly seriously. And so that'll be a great headliner.
And when you meet him, when I met him, I mean, I'd seen him on video being interviewed, but the guy is just an ordinary guy. He's not affected by this notoriety. In many ways, he wished it had never happened to him, but he's had to come to terms with it because he's effectively dominated his life. But he's a very down-to-earth guy, And basically what happened to him could have happened to anybody. In the same way that Britain's most famous abductee is a police officer retired police officer called Alan Godfrey. I researched his case for 18 months, and it's now regarded as Britain's first largely acknowledged abduction case. And it's almost an identical scenario of basically being, whilst on duty, seen an object, then the next thing he has is there's a jump in time, what is now referred to as missing time. He's then finds himself inside an object where he's laid on his back and he's been examined by small creatures, which he then, and this is 1980, 5 years after Travis's account, where he basically said small creatures are putting equipment on his legs, and he describes them as lamp heads, bulb heads, which is, not the typical alien grey that we think of, but this was, in a sense, just at the time, Communion, the book, which now features the iconic alien grey head, came out because it was on the cover. So really, that consciousness was not even there, but he's describing them as lamp heads and bulb heads, the small creatures with the big heads and the big eyes. So in a sense, he was describing them in his own language, which adds to the credibility of his case. I researched it for 18 months. It's a fantastic case. And he was videoed under regression 3 times. I'm one of the very few people ever to see the whole. He was interviewed 4 times, regressed 3 times on video, but not the first time. But the second, third and fourth interview session I've seen, and I was allowed access to view it by Harry Harris, the Manchester solicitor who dealt with him and got all the hypnotism organised. And they were done by 2 professors. These are just not anybody. These were 2 professors from Manchester University. And it was all done very properly, and you can see it. And all the story is consistent. It never changes. And to this day, Alan Godfrey would probably say he wished it had never happened to him. He did gain some notoriety from it, but he got a lot of things. It pretty much ended his first marriage. His kids were ridiculed. He was ridiculed. He got loads of hassle from the police force that he was in, the West Yorkshire Police. His life was a nightmare for many years. And so there's not many good things that come out of it.
I can guess that can be the personal effect of that ridicule that we were mentioning in the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
Next week on the Bunker Show, we've got Neil Sanders, who's an expert in mind control. So
yep.
Hopefully from today's talk with you, we'll have some interesting questions for him about that kind of mass neurosis, that pressure to keep some subjects sort of off limits. And you mentioned also that the Ministry of Defence exemplify that. One of the guests you had at last year's conference was a gentleman called AJ Javard, who's from South America and Brazil. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
And they have a different attitude over there. Could you maybe explain a bit of that and maybe relate that to some of how they've been able to investigate some of the abduction or some of the close encounters that they've had over there?
Well, what AJ Javard is the editor of the Brazilian UFO magazine. It's a printed magazine. Obviously, Brazil, it's Portuguese. But what he's been able to do with his research colleagues is something that is pretty unique in ufology. Basically, what's happened there is he has managed to get in place a actual protocol where the top ufologists sit down perhaps 3 times a year with the Brazilian Defense Ministry and Brazilian Air Force, Army, and they sit down around a table, and half of the table is military officials in uniform, and the other half is Brazilian UFO researchers. And they talk about the release of documents and certain time frames, and the ufologists are allowed to ask questions and whatever. And the attitude is completely different. If I was to try to attempt that with the Ministry of Defence, I'd get laughed at. There is just no way. Britain, who is one of the most secretive governments on the world, which follows the lead of America, because America is the most secretive government in the world, and America, because of our special historical relationship, follows and pretty much does everything America wishes, we fall into that line. But the reality is that if you go to South America, countries like Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, many of their top military officials have come out on record, in name, in person, and said, we've been studying UFOs for many, many years. We conclude that they are extraterrestrial. Now, you would think that that kind of revelation would make every newspaper around the world because of the detailing given. But believe it or not, other than South America, it doesn't go anywhere. It's never reported in America. It's never reported in Europe. Why? Because America doesn't want that way.
How does that sort of difference, that the fact that there is conversation, the fact that I guess it's not so ridiculed in South America?
No, well, I was amazed. I mean, I knew they were more open to it. But just to put things in perspective, I went there for the first time to Brazil in December 2012 for A.J. Javard's big conference there. It was a big international conference with delegates from 15 or 20 countries. And basically, on the Thursday night, there was a meet of speakers. Well, there was 500 people in the room. People weren't doing a lecture. This was just for all the speakers to stand up, do the 3 minutes and say, I'll be talking about this. There were 500 people in the room and there were 500 people queuing outside. Well, in the UK, it's nothing like that at all. You struggle if you get 250 at a conference per day. But there, it was completely different. The attitude of the people and they actually had, at that first one, that one in 2012, they actually had a general from the Air Force in uniform to open the opening address. Well, can you imagine getting an Air Commodore from the Royal Air Force to open a UFO conference in England? I don't think so. It's completely bizarre.
I could imagine maybe a couple of spooks popping along to a UFO conference.
Oh, I'm sure they're there in the audience. I do believe that they are there. But you've just got to accept that they're there because that's what they've always done.
Well, it obviously shows. It obviously shows that the reports you're compiling and the people who do come to the conferences that you and I think Anthony Beckett organise.
Anthony does the Exo-Politics conferences in Leeds, of which he's done I think 7 now, and they're excellent conferences.
Yeah, and your conference, which is up in Homeforth, is that right? September.
If you think of Last of the Summer Wine, the Pretty Village, that's where I live near there, so that's where it's based. We've had 3 conferences so far, and this 4th one is right in the centre. It's at a new location. It's at what's called the Picture Drome. It's September, Saturday 10th and the 11th, Saturday, Sunday. It's a beautiful village in the West Yorkshire Hills. It's got a river going through it. All the cafes and amenities are within 150 metres of the venue, and people love it. We've done 3 conferences. Last year we had 550 people over 2 days. This year I'm going to a slightly bigger venue. Hopefully that's going to be about 640 for the 2 days. But if anybody is interested, all you have to do is put UFO Truth Magazine into Google. It'll come straight up. Go to the website. You can book the tickets online. But I'll make this as well, is that if anybody wants, I do the UFO Truth Magazine, which is a bi-monthly 96-page e-zine. It's not in print because there's no overhead costs. It allows me to use the money to create conferences and give donations to other UFO subjects, things like that. But basically, if anybody wants a complimentary issue of the magazine, if they email me at heseltinegary@hotmail.com, I will send them a complimentary issue of one of the 16 issues to date. And what I will tell you about that magazine is that it features the very top researchers in the world, all under one roof, and everybody you can think of, Steve Bassett, Richard Dole, Peter Robbins, Grant Cameron, all the top people have written for the magazine. Stanton Friedman, the world's top a nuclear physicist. He's recently come on as a regular columnist. Nick Redfern, who's one of the most prolific authors, English, now lives in Dallas, Texas. He's now becoming a regular columnist. It's got everybody. A.J. Javard's a columnist. It's got everybody. So if you're interested in the subject and you want a free offer, then email me and I will send you a complimentary issue. How's that?
Okay, Gary, can you say your email address again?
heseltinegary@hotmail.com. But if you put the spelling up on your website, but it's HESELTINE Gary with one R at hotmail.com, all in lowercase.
And that's brilliant. And that's UFO Truth Mag, which I really recommend people go and check out, because it's very much in the spirit of UFO Magazine.
He's my hero. He was my mentor. I got to know Graham Bardsley for the last 2 years of his life until he sadly died at the age of 49, which was a terrible shock. And I said at the time that it had put ufology back 10 years, and it did, because there literally was nothing else as successful as that. But I'm getting a lot of feedback now from subscribers and readers saying that it's very it's a good quality UFO publication. It's always evidential based, from my point of view, as where I can. And
a fantastic, as you say, a fantastic array of contributors. And so it's a great offer, and if anybody's slightly interested in the subject, I can wholeheartedly recommend taking Gary up on his offer. You won't be sorry, that's for sure.
There's a chap in the chat room, Gary, who's asking about where the public he's thinking the public can't take him very seriously by ufologists, where you collect from police officers and Air Force people. Do you also collect from general public, or what would you have?
All the time.
Take seriously, you take that just as credibly as anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. What I've got is I've developed my own sighting report forms, which one for the police officers. On or off duty, but if it's a civilian, of which a lot of people contact me, I send them a civilian sighting report form, and then they can add to it. It's sent online. They can print it off, either post it to me or complete it online and email it back to me, and you can add pages to it. So that's how I deal with that. What you've got to understand is that the vast majority of people that come forward, because of this ridicule factor, they generally recalling events that are historical. In fact, a gentleman yesterday rang me. He was 80 years of age, and he'd come across me on TV, and he said, "I've just got to tell you my story." And he went on to tell me his story, and it was a very good sighting, but we're talking during his national service, military sighting with military witnesses, and it was in the about 1958. So, I mean, these cases are out there, and people are contacting me all the time. So, by all means, I'll accept any report, but primarily I have the database of police officers.
Yeah, and of course, I should imagine the more recent, the better as well, because it can be quite tough for people to. Well,
we touched upon it earlier that the Ministry of Defence closed the UFO reporting facility. Because the vast majority, if somebody sees something tonight, who do they ring? Ordinarily, if they live near a military base, they'd probably ring the nearest military base. But if they didn't live near a military base, who do you ring if you see something tonight? Well, the answer up until 2009 was the police. And basically, after the MOD closed its desk now, if they report it to the police now, the police don't do anything with it. And interestingly, I contacted all the police forces, or 38 of the 43 police forces, when they closed the desk, whilst I was still a serving officer, and asked them to send me the sightings, because you're still going to get them from members of the public. And they still do get them, but they don't do anything with them, because there's no reporting facility now that centralises it. And now what you're left with is various UFO sites, myself included, as the magazine, collect them. But it's disjointed, and that, I think, was done deliberately to dumb it down and make it difficult for the media to analyse figures. So there is no one agency now that can say, oh yeah, in 2015 we had 600 sightings reported. We don't have that now, and it's very fragmented, and I think that was deliberate policy by the MOD to make it fragmented. And unfortunately, it has worked very successfully.
Well, I'm very glad that you and your database, as well as other researchers like Richard D. Hall, are picking up that slack that the MOD is so plainly
Well, we're
dropping.
trying. That's the main thing. We're trying.
And I hope that people, subscribe and support you and UFO Truth Magazine.
Thank you for the promo.
Well, because it's very important that subjects like these and the questions that some of we've outlined in today's show, such as the Rendlesham Forest incident, being of national security importance.
Well, let me just as we're on that. So, you mentioned the conferences earlier. In 2014. One of the speakers at the conference was Captain Robert Salas, retired, but he was the guy who was sat in the nuclear missile bunker with his 2 keys ready to go for nuclear Armageddon should the call ever come. He was in charge of releasing nuclear weapons. Well, his case in 1967 in the American Midwest, he's in his bunker. His topside guard says, "We've got a UFO over the bunkers." And he said, "Are you joking?" He says, "No, it's over the base, over the bunkers, the missile silos." And then guess what? 10 of his nuclear weapons went offline, which is technically impossible. Had never happened before. 10 nuclear weapons were shut down by the UFO. Now, that is a matter of public record, and he gave evidence at the citizens' hearings in Washington in 2013, and obviously told us firsthand at the conference. But, I mean, is that not of defence significance? UFOs shutting down nuclear missile silos? I think we should be knowing about that, don't you? And it never made the national media. It made regional media in America at the time, but it never made the national media.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for bringing it to our attention, because that's definitely a question that stands. So, yeah, Michael Salas, if people want to look into it further.
Michael Salas, S-A-L-A-S.
S-A-L-A-S. Okay, yeah. We're just about to come to the home stretch now, and it's one of my favourite questions I like asking on the bunker. So, do you have a message for the people in Westminster for what they need to do with the UFO subject?
I suspect that virtually all MPs know next to nothing about the genuine reality of the best evidence. That's genuine. And I also think that's true of the mainstream media. The higher echelons, the vast majority of people and reporters don't know the reality of the subject. I suspect, though, that some civil servants, long-standing in the media, in Westminster, who have been there for many years, who see government and parties come and go, they remain. They will know much more. And I also suspect that the senior people in the intelligence services in Britain, the Air Force, certain people will know exactly what's going on. America knows exactly what's going on, but it's a small minority. And that's the reality. It's compartmentalized. Very few people really know what's going on. But what I would say to all the politicians is that if any of them were listening to the show tonight in Westminster and they were curious to know who this guy was, i.e. me, who's talking about things in a very factual way, evidence-based, then they are more than welcome to contact me, and I will do a briefing to any MP, minister or anything, because I think the vast majority of people are left in the dark and they genuinely don't know, and it's about time they did know.
That's one hell of a message. Thank you very much, Gary, and I hope that as some of the members of Parliament take you up on that offer. Being a direct man of action, that's really reassuring. We're just about out of time in the bunker here this evening. We've got the Dark City Cannabis Compassion Club coming up. Tomorrow evening we've got some great stuff on Dark City with the Pax Mundi show with Nigel. Makes it one of the best research shows on the net. I Am show with Sarah and James Anderson from Citizen Guard, who's well worth catching. Another man of action, that's for sure.
Yes,
Thank you.
Been on our show too. Thanks for a brilliant show, Gary.
Thank you for inviting me on, and anytime you want me back, just let me know. We can maybe do.
Thanks to the guys in the chat room as well.
Yeah, no, fine. But if ever you want to do a more structured show where you want a specific topic discussed, aired, there are so many facets to this subject of which I can talk about, and we can have a really good discussion. So anytime you want.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Gary. I had a whole bunch of questions to ask you about disclosure and such, but we'll leave it till next time. Okay, thank you a lot.
Thank you very much.
All the best, Gary. And join us next week in the bunker where we've got Neil Sanders, and here's the Cannabis Compassion Club coming up.